Well, the fantastic thing about the Igbo conversion is the extent of the growth. When Shanahan took over in 1905, there were less than 2,000. Now the growth was like this: 1905, 2,000. 1925, 20,000. 1945, 200,000. 1965, 2 million. That's a fantastic growth by any standards, and unparalleled in any part of the world, and could not be possible except for the Igbos, because they were the rich soil in which the seeds were planted, and they brought forth fruit 1,000-fold.
Joseph Shanahan, the apostle of southern Nigeria, was born in a Tipperary farmhouse in 1871. He began his education in the little schoolhouse at Glenkeen, and then went on to Rockwell College, run by the Holy Ghost Fathers, where his sturdy physique made him a useful member of the college rugby team. Here he applied for admission to the Holy Ghost Order and was accepted. He was sent to one of their colleges in France to study philosophy and theology, and then returned to Rockwell to complete his preparation for the priesthood. In 1900, at the age of 29, he was ordained priest in the chapel at Blackrock College, Dublin. He applied for the African mission, and in 1902 was assigned to work in southern Nigeria. In those days, West Africa was still known as the white man's grave. It took courage and motivation of a high order to volunteer for such a mission.
He was tremendously opposed to slavery. He was the first person that I ever knew that really understood liberation theology. For him, the whole man had to be freed, and he was very strong on that. If you become a missionary, you must go out, he said, to liberate the whole man. Liberate him through education, liberate him through Christianity, liberate him through hygiene, liberate him through medicine. But he said, you must liberate the whole man. Jesus worked for the whole man. He healed the whole man. That's the job of the missionary.
Shanahan landed at Port Harcourt and sailed 250 miles up the vast Niger River before landing at Onitsha. Onitsha was a trading post with one of the busiest slave markets in southern Nigeria. Here he had his first contact with the Igbo people, among whom he was to work for the next 30 years.
The African view of God was that there was a multitude of spirits active among humans, some good, some bad, that you placated the bad ones and you kept the good ones on your side. But overall spirits, there was Chiuku, the great spirit, or Chineke they call him sometimes, the creating spirit. And he was responsible for all life on earth and all spirit life and all human life. And you had to respect everything living, animals, trees, birds, everything. Even if you needed it for food, you still respected it as God's creation. And Shanahan felt always that an understanding of life was vital to the African. And therefore, as soon as he got them to be Christians, he spoke on divine life as the highest form of life through baptism.
The mission of southern Nigeria was confided to the French Holy Ghost Fathers, and they came out for the first time in 1885. Then they were joined by a couple of Irish, because the government was British, and that didn't suit the French so well. But the French, anyway, began their apostolate, and their idea was, you build a house, you build a church, et la mission est fondée, et bien fondée. The work is done. Now we wait for the people to come. And in waiting for the people to come, there were a number of slaves being brought down river. And one of the jobs they took on then was redeeming these slaves and bringing them into the church, so that it was in part a slave church. Now, that was followed by Shanahan. Shanahan took over in 1905. That's after 20 years exactly. He had less than 2,000 Christians in his church. And his attitude now was completely different. He said, instead of waiting for the people to come, we go out to them. Therefore, we go out on trek and we go from town to town. We must have something to offer them. And what we offer them is education. So he and his priests then, there were about 8 of them altogether, set out on their bicycles and they visited town after town. They met the chiefs and they asked them if they wanted a school. The advantages of a school were made known to them, so they readily agreed.
Shanahan had tremendous regard for the chiefs. He liked them very much because he really loved the African. He said that the chiefs were nearly always the best people in the town if you knew how to handle them. But you had to know how to handle them. And especially you had to get them to laugh. And he always told them funny stories and things that made them laugh. But then he'd come to the serious side and he'd get the chiefs always on his side. And then he would ask the chief to give me the son you love most now, and I'd bring him up as a boy with myself. And I'll send him back a far more educated and advanced person than he is at present. So he used to get the chiefs to give him his sons that way. He'd take one son from Chief A, another from Chief B, and that way he'd get political influence, you see, in towns, because these fellows would afterwards become chiefs themselves. And he was very far-seeing in all that. The chiefs loved him, and whenever he went to any meeting of chiefs in an area, they would all rally round and they used to salute him with elephant tusks. That was their famous trumpet. And if you stood 20 yards away from, say, 10 elephant tusks, genuine elephant tusks, you'd find the ground under you shaking visibly, just like an earthquake.
The arrangement then made with them was, you build the school, you pay the teacher, and we'll give you a teacher. Now, of course, building a school was an easy thing. There isn't a stone in the whole of the diocese of Owerri. So these schools were made of mud, of which there is plenty, with dwarf walls, and then the roofs came from the palm tree leaves. So you could build a school in a week. And now, more important, he set up then in the school a teacher, and that teacher was a station teacher. And his job was not only to teach the students in the morning, but part of his condition of service was that he would teach doctrine to the adults in the evening. So they came in the evening and they learned, because their curiosity had been aroused by the children going home and talking of these schools. So that's the way it worked then. That station now was set up with its teacher. The priest moved on to another station, founded another school there, and between them then they began to found schools. And that became the Irish method.
In 1905, only 3 years after his arrival, Shanahan was appointed superior of the Southern Nigerian Mission. The Irish method became official policy, and schools began to spring up all over Igboland. Shanahan pressed further and further into the interior, reaching the remotest parts of Nigeria and beyond.
Well, you know, his most famous trek in Africa was when he was asked by Rome to visit the Cameroons, which had been marooned and left without priests for the 3 or 4 years of the Great War. And he went there in 1919. And when he went in, he found that the people welcomed him very much everywhere, but their little villages were scattered over huge mountains, and it was a tremendously mountain area, you see, and a great place for elephants, but no place for humans, you know, most of it. So he got a mule somewhere anyway, and he climbed to every station they had in the Cameroons. And he described how wonderful it was to say Christmas Mass for them there, and to see them coming, after travelling for days, just to attend the Christmas Mass. And then they all wanted confession, they wanted their children baptised, and he did all that for them, you see, in a variety of centres. But at one centre, towards the end of his time there, a catechist came from a place he couldn't get at because he got very sick and had to be shipped home. And catechist arrived anyway from the place and heard where he was. He was down in Douala. So the catechist arrived there and produced a big list and said that you didn't visit my station, it's the only one you missed. And the bishop said, or he wasn't bishop at the time, but Father Shanahan said to him, well, I had it on my list, but there's nothing I could do about it. Oh, well, he said, we have done everything ourselves. They've all given me their sins to tell you, and you are to send back the forgiveness through me. So he said, you should have heard the list of sins. So anyway, the catechist read out the list of sins there and then without the slightest shame, you see. And Shanahan told him, the Lord will certainly absolve you because you have faith in his power, and you have faith in the power of the priest. And I will now kneel down, he said, and I'll ask him to absolve all these people. So I did, he said. And I'm quite sure he did absolve them, he said. And even though everyone has laughed at him after hearing the story, he said, I have no doubt that the sins were forgiven.
In 1920, Shanahan was appointed bishop, the first bishop of Igboland. He returned to Ireland for the ceremony of ordination, which took place in Maynooth College on the 6th of June, his 49th birthday. He made a remarkable impact on everyone who met him, especially on the Maynooth students, who regarded him as an almost legendary figure from an age of heroes and apostles. Back in Africa, an even more enthusiastic welcome was awaiting him. Everywhere he went, people came crowding to see and hear the first bishop that had ever lived in the land of the Igbos. He was especially heartened by the number of young men who began to volunteer for the priesthood, and by the ordination of the first Igbo priest, a hopeful sign for the future.
I would say Bishop Shanahan wasn't an intellectual at all, but he was a man of great intuitions. And these two seminal seeds that I spoke of, trekking to go out to the people, was one. The next one, education for the people, was two. Then he was left with a problem. He had nobody to look after the girls. There were no sisters there. So he solved that problem by coming home to Ireland and inviting young women to come out and work there. That was something very new. It's not new now, but it was new then.
The first two volunteers from Ireland arrived in 1921. One was Agnes Ryan, the other was Mary Martin. Mary later founded the Medical Missionaries of Mary, and Agnes became one of the first Holy Rosary Sisters. The founding of an order of missionary sisters was a natural outcome of Shanahan's concern for the women of Nigeria. He borrowed £5,000 and bought a large house in Killeshandra, which was to be the headquarters of the new order, the Holy Rosary Sisters. Some of the first volunteers still have vivid memories of their founder.
We were still postulants, and Bishop Shanahan came, and I was astonished. We were walking around the garden, and he came along and joined us. And we walked around the garden, the small garden in Killeshandra, for a good while, and he talked to all of us. He gave me the feeling, certainly, got the feeling that he was the most Christ-like person I had ever met. That was his way. He made us feel that we had something very important to contribute in Africa.
Oh, I remember going through the fields and you'd just be enthralled by his very attitude towards everything that was growing, and he'd draw our attention to it. Later, when I went to Nigeria, I do remember bats. I was afraid of bats. Oh, I said, they're ugly things. And he said, don't call anything God has created ugly. I just remember that was on the veranda in Emakuku.
The first group of postulants made their vows in the little convent chapel and prepared for the journey to Nigeria. Shanahan had watched anxiously over every stage of their training, visiting them when in Ireland and writing to them when in Africa. The life you are preparing to undertake, he told them, is one that makes exceptional demands. There are before you, as before all missionaries, sufferings and trials. But remember, it is Christ himself who sweats in our sweat, who burns in our fever, who aches in our tired limbs.
7 sisters were going out together. It was the first big set going to Nigeria, and it filled his heart with joy. He came to the other Holy Ghost Fathers and himself came to the North Wall with us, but he travelled over with us to Liverpool. And he blessed us. It was the first time any of us had been on a boat, I think. And he told us that he would always turn towards Africa and bless us. And he would bless the seas that we would travel on. The whole atmosphere that he created spoke more than his words, that you just felt a God there and all nature. You know, you felt part of the whole creation and you were doing your part in it.
The first contingent of Holy Rosary Sisters landed at Onitsha in February 1928. They brought with them large, mysterious packing cases filled with books, clothing, religious objects, household goods. One group even brought a supply of Irish chickens, who settled down happily in their new surroundings. The first duty of the newly arrived sisters was to learn the language and undergo a crash course in Igbo culture and customs. Then they began their work of educating the women and girls of Igbo land. It was education in the broadest sense. It is only a beginning, Shanahan wrote in 1929. Later on, the sisters will be able to take charge on a large scale of the religious instruction in many of our catechetical stations. They will prepare young and old for reception of the sacraments, teach the girls sewing, personal hygiene, etc. Their influence for good in all departments will be extraordinary. The sisters' interest in healthcare soon led to the setting up of clinics and hospitals. Many of them studied nursing in Ireland before coming to Nigeria. Others qualified as doctors. They passed on their skills to the Igbo women, who became nurses and doctors and sisters themselves in the service of their own people.
He hadn't enough priests and couldn't get enough priests from the Holy Ghost congregation. So he went on to Maynooth, to Cardinal Doe, and he asked them there, would you not give me a loan of these priests for a while? Give them to me for 5 years and I'll give them back to you. So that started something new again. In the first case of their going out, 6 went out together. And then they came home and they found they had nothing to do. So they went back for a second tour. Then they said they liked the country and didn't want to leave it. They didn't want to become religious, so they wouldn't join us. And they founded the Society of St. Patrick's at Kiltegan. So there again was something new. And these days we talk of priests going on loan from here. Already Shanahan had it. So these are examples then of the intuitions that he had.
The priests he brought to Nigeria were men who shared his vision of a truly African Christianity.
When he got onto spiritual things, he'd simply say, when you're talking to the African, don't just talk the penny catechism. He said that was fine for the Irish in its time. It's no good for the African. You must look up at the palm tree, he would say, and talk about, do you see how life is in that palm tree? Where has it got it? Have you given it life? And from that you get on to what they really believe in life. And you get on to God alone can give life. And he would then recommend every missionary to have tremendous respect for the African. The African has much deeper ideas than you imagine, he said. He understands life in a way we don't. He understands spirituality, he said, in a way we don't. So he said, you're going to a people that understand God. And you must understand God their way, not your way. And they will understand the gospel, he said, if you make it live. You can change him from paganism to Christianity, but you are changing a person who had received a lot from his paganism and had done a lot of quiet thinking without books. He said the only way to get these people on your side is educate them. And he said, therefore, the school was my primary apostolate, not that I wanted to give them an empty education. I wanted to give them an education that led them to God.
In 1932, Bishop Shanahan returned to Ireland. Failing health made it impossible for him to continue his work in Africa, and a successor was appointed. But even in Ireland, he continued to work for Africa. He travelled the length and breadth of the country, giving lectures, addressing meetings, arousing interest, encouraging vocations, organising support for the Igbo mission. But his heart was still in Africa. In 1935, Bishop Shanahan paid his last visit to Nigeria. A new cathedral had just been built at Onitsha, and he was asked to perform the ceremony of consecration. It was a very emotional occasion, both for him and for the people. Onitsha was the place where he first landed in 1902, an unknown and apprehensive young priest. They didn't want him to leave them, and he didn't want to go.
I happened to be in Port Harcourt the day he was leaving. Just a few of us were there. Two of our sisters were returning with him, who had come out, our Mother General and her secretary. And he said his last Mass. He wrote on a little picture for each of us also. What shall I render to the Lord for all he has given to me? But yet he was a very lonely man. And even during the Mass, he broke down. And then we went down, as soon as Mass was over, down to the quays in Port Harcourt. And he stood on the deck, blessed us as they went out.
Bishop Shanahan had undergone many trials in his lifetime, but none of them compared with that final parting from Nigeria. Welcomed though he was in Ireland, he found it impossible to settle down there. Everywhere he went, he was honoured as a great mission pioneer, but these honours meant nothing to him. He was urged to write his memoirs, but had to abandon it. The memories it aroused were more than he could bear. Finally, a bishop in East Africa took pity on him and invited him to live in Nairobi, where the climate was healthier than in Nigeria. He gladly accepted the invitation. He went off to Killeshandra to tell the good news to his beloved Holy Rosary sisters. He was full of new hope, which they couldn't share. Those who said goodbye to him at Killeshandra and in Dublin knew that he was a dying man. Death came for Bishop Shanahan on Christmas Day in 1943, and he was laid to rest in Nairobi. It was only a temporary resting place. After the end of World War II, the grave was reopened and the remains of the great bishop were brought back to Nigeria. The funeral became a triumphal tour of all the places he had known and loved. Beginning at Enugu, it went through Udi and Oka to Onitsha, his first landfall. Then to Ihiala and Owerri and Port Harcourt, where he had said his last goodbyes. To Aba and Orlu and Emakuku of the Baths. Finally, it returned to the cathedral at Onitsha, his last resting place. They buried him in the transept of the cathedral. A simple stone slab marks the spot. Many pilgrims have come to pray at his grave, among them Pope John Paul II. Joseph Shanahan, priest, missionary, apostle. An Igbo bishop summed him up in 5 simple words. He was our St. Patrick.